We launch our own podcast. You can listen to it through Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. We'll be covering stories from around the world, similar to those you see on this program, but we'll get a bit more personal and candid with our guests and correspondents. So if you're on the go, whether on the train, driving to work, or just out for a run, give us a listen and make sure to subscribe. Search online for CGTN and the Heat podcast.
I bow my head before India's 1.3 billion citizens.
India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi and his BJP party win re-election in a landslide victory. Hello, I'm Nathan King filling in for Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Hello again. Before we begin, we're excited to tell you that we are launching our new podcast this week with in-depth and personal interviews. I'll have more on that later in the show. But first, after 6 weeks and 600 million votes, India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi is celebrating a stunning victory. Voters gave the BJP party a majority in Parliament, winning or leading in 352 seats in the lower house of Parliament, surpassing the 272-seat majority needed to form a government. Modi secured a bigger victory than 2014, something no Indian party has accomplished in nearly 50 years.
If anyone has won, it's India. If anyone has won, it's this democracy. If anyone has won, it's the people of India. So all of us, BJP workers and our partners in the National Democratic Alliance, dedicate this win to the public.
Now, the leader of India's main opposition Congress party, Rahul Gandhi, congratulated Modi in a stunning defeat. Gandhi also lost his own parliamentary seat, which his family has held for generations. Now, for more on Narendra Modi's victory and the challenges facing India, let's bring in our panel. Joining us now from New Delhi is Subramanian Swamy. He is nominated for a member of the upper house of the Indian Parliament. Also from New Delhi is Rwitwika Battacharya. She is CEO of the non-partisan organization Swaniti. And here in the studio is Shareen Joshi. She's an associate professor of the Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. And from New York is Srinivas Thiruvandanthai. He is a director of the research of the Jerome Levy Forecasting Center. Thanks so much, all of you, from joining us from India and elsewhere. Dr. Swamy, I think we have to start with you. Congratulations to the BJP. Obviously, you're a member of the party. What made Modi's victory so complete?
I think there are multiple factors. Of course, his personality, his simplicity, and his oratory in terms of the common man's language. These played a very big role. He's personally honest. That's how it has come out. Nobody has been able to pin any corruption charge against him. Then there is our government. Nobody has been accused. No minister has been accused of any corruption like in the past. And we have prosecuted prominent members of the opposition, Ms. Sonia Gandhi, Rahul Gandhi. They are out on bail in a corruption case. Similarly, Mr. Chidambaram, the finance minister, is also on bail. And there are some others also on bail who have been ministers. And none of that was true about the BJP. Then, of course, this terror has created a new sense of nationalism. And then Modi's ability to retaliate by bombing parts of Pakistan across the international border, that had a huge effect. And finally, the new voters who have come in the last 5 years, the younger generation is definitely much more nationalistic, and they were targeted by the social media, which Modi is very keen on. And the certain neglected parts of India, the northeast, Bengal, where there was no challenge to the strong arm tactics of the chief minister, the BJP showed itself as an alternative, and so BJP is shot up from 2 seats to 16 seats now. These factors together are responsible for our victory. And there was a feeling that because of the poor performance in the economic front, it will affect us. But in Indian elections, economic issues have been having very marginal effect.
Thanks so much. Shareen Joshi here in the studio. And let's pick up on that, because the reason people were so surprised is because the economy hasn't been doing that well. But Modi has this amazing story, doesn't he? And he seems to have tapped into a lot of the aspirations of a very young India. Explain that to us.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you see, one reading of this election result is this was not so much a referendum on policies over the past 5 years, but rather this was a presidential style campaign in a parliamentary democracy. What you see is they had a clear narrative focusing on a strong and decisive leader, someone who could save India. You know, they had a solid strategy. They had a very strong grassroots operation. And they really, you know, as Dr. Swamy is saying, used social media to really tap into new voting pools. What you have on the other side is an opposition that had none of this, right? They were, you know, they were disorganized.
But this is the Congress Party who
Yes.
controlled India essentially for decades. What's happened?
They had a manifesto with good ideas. They had an unconvincing leader, though. I think they had a weak organizational strategy. In the past 5 years, what they ought to have been doing is investing at the grassroots level, listening to people, and developing a communications plan, which they did not do, from what I can tell. So I think what you see is a big win for the BJP, but is also built on the back of a weakness in the opposition.
Rwitwika, would you like to pick up on that in New Delhi? Because it's incredible how many people vote in Indian elections. You know, 600 million voters nearly. And yet so many went for the BJP, considering how disparate and dynamic the Indian subcontinent is. What went on?
Absolutely. I think the big piece of this entire equation was also development. See, I think when it comes to a lot of the programs that the Prime Minister had launched, it really resonated. And I think a lot of good work was in fact also done on the ground. So if I were to take an example of, you know, the open defecation-free India, a few weeks ago I was in this very rural part of East India in Jharkhand, and I was talking to a few people, and they said, you know, we have toilets now. And I think we are kind of overlooking a little bit of the development that's come in. Bank accounts have been opened, toilets have been built. And the fact that there's a leader at the helm who's talking about these and actually doing, to some extent, a bit of work on the ground on development and moving a lot of this forward has played a huge part of it. And that he's an open advocate for it has played a huge part and has really resonated the people, this message of development and a growing India.
Srinivas, is it that simple? Is it toilets? Is it development for those who have sort of been left behind by India's development? Or is there more going on in this sort of Modi movement that really has caught the world by surprise?
No, I think that's what you said is absolutely true. In fact, if you look at a lot of polls that are already shown that Modi is very popular among women and among young people. He's more popular among women than among men, and that's where these many of the programs are actually directed at women. For example, one of his programs was getting LPG cylinders to the poor families. Most of us take these for granted, but people who cook with coal burnt or wood fire burnt stuffs, it's smoky, it is obviously very irritating, and here you are giving, and these are women who feel this and women who bear the brunt of it. The same with the toilet thing. You have, you know, for women, especially defecating outside is an extremely personal thing. It's much more difficult for women than for men. And, you know, in fact, a very popular movie was made on this whole story about open defecation. And so clearly those things have been a huge force in mobilizing poor voters. Combined with that is also the message of security, and which has resonated with across the sections, but also the younger voters of when the firm response to what happened in Pakistan. So it was a two-pronged thing, but clearly the economy delivering the basic things to poor people, which the Indian state has until now failed to do, is a very big thing.
So, Dr. Swamy, focusing on the needs of the poorest, Modi has an interesting story in terms of himself and where he came from. Does that resonate with the Indian people?
Yeah.
And what about the Hindu nationalism behind the BJP? Because a lot of outsiders see a less inclusive India than perhaps before.
Well, first of all, let me say that I wouldn't call this as economics. It's microeconomics. And the question of unemployment, for example, is a serious problem. But it never came up for discussion because this microeconomic touching the family individually, and then they spreading the word and others also expecting the same benefits to come. So this macroeconomic talk doesn't wash much with the poor classes. Now, as far as the Hindutva question is concerned, that actually is a uniting factor, because in the past the votes of the Hindus used to be divided on caste lines, regional lines, linguistic lines. So people rose above all that, and that was because of the fact that we focused on the development of the Hindu freedom, or the Hindu independence, or the Hindu at least fighting the appeasement of the minorities. These things had a great deal of resonance, and people cut across caste lines and voted for us.
Shareen, do you agree with that? That India had been so divided in the past along caste and class lines, and Hindu identity unites 80% of the population, but we're still thinking about 20% of the population. And I seem to remember the BJP didn't field a single Muslim candidate in these elections.
I think that, you know, two reactions. One is picking up on earlier the theme of development. I think I agree with Dr. Swamy that India has huge economic problems. And the successes that have been touted on the development agenda, you know, cooking stoves for women or toilets, are micro initiatives that have not, frankly, reached scale yet, right? So it's more, again, that presidential style campaign of messaging that worked. It captured hearts and minds, if you will. On this
problems of the ordinary person, rather than the sort of elevated discussions that we're used to in
rather than policy successes,
yeah.
right? Now, on the issue of nationalism, I think the BJP thrives on some ambiguity. I think this is a party that has two faces. There's one face of a modern reformist India that wants to fulfill India's potential. It wants to grow. It wants to have greater voice in the world. I think there's a second phase, which is of Hindu nationalism, right? Which is of taking on hard issues related to minorities, the issue of citizenship, the issue of appeasement, as Dr. Swamy said. And I really think in the past 5 years, the BJP has not delivered to the maximum extent on either of these, right? Now, that's to also say it hasn't made anyone's worst fears come true either, right? So I think the real question, I think in this election, you definitely saw that second phase. And in the Prime Minister's, you know, speech, you saw a pivot back to that development. You know, there are only two castes in India, to be poor or to work for the poor.
I like that. Sorry, go ahead, Dr. Swamy, yes.
Just this much, let's see, we also successfully divided the minorities. For instance, women, the divorce, which is called the triple talaq, where a man can divorce his wife by just sending an SMS that I'm divorcing you in Arabic. That we have abolished by law, and that had a huge effect. I mean, there are at least 21 seats we have won, which are majority Muslim areas, and that's because the women voted for us. Then we have also Shias voting for us, and there are others, other different, only the what we call as the Sunni or the Wahhabi Sunni, that they didn't vote for us, and mostly the men didn't vote for us.
Srinivas, pick up on that. I mean, obviously there has been a huge victory here, but what is the next Modi government going to look like, and what are they going to do, given the economic problems, but also the geostrategic position that India is in as well?
So the economy, part of the problem for the economy in the last 5 years was dealing with the excesses of the previous regime. There was a huge amount of bank NPAs that the government had to work off. And there was also inflation that had to be controlled. We had double-digit inflation coming into 2013. And so those things had to be worked off. And so obviously that a bitter medicine had to be taken to some extent. I mean, the government has taken some missteps, but overall, it was not, it was a tough medicine that had to be taken. Plus, there were two programs. One was demonetization and the other was GST, both of which were disruptive in the short run.
Explain for our viewers, that's when they took the 1,000 rupee note and the 500 rupee note out of circulation. Why was that? And I remember a lot of controversy about that, but why do they do it? And what effect did that have? And was it popular in the end? Because, taking money out of circulation, never always that popular.
Well, it so happened that I was in India on that day, exactly on that day when it happened. And here is the thing, and I looked into it and I've written a paper on this. The point is that the black money, there is good evidence, circumstantial evidence that black money was on the rise. And most of the black money doesn't actually get stored in notes, but you do need the cash to be able to make those transactions, whether you're bribing somebody or whether you're doing illegal real estate transaction where you're suppressing the value of the property, and so on and so forth. And so whether this was the best move or not, I do not know that. I think this was an okay move. And there have been long-term benefits from this. One is tax compliance has increased. There is clear evidence of that. Number two, digitalization has increased dramatically since then. So there have been some benefits from that. So that was then. And there's also the GST, which is actually for the first time in independent India, it has actually created a unified market in India.
GST, sorry, explain that.
See, it's the generalized sales tax. So what we used to have is an array of taxes at state level, at municipality level. We have replaced that with one single central taxing mechanism. So it's not like every time you cross a border from one state to the other, you're being imposed a tax. So it's now created a unified Indian market. So these are the benefits of these things. You have created a launch pad. The benefits of these things will come in the years to come. So I think there are some positive developments, and clearly same with the bank NPAs. Now the bank NPAs are coming down, especially with the bankruptcy reform. Actually, there's been a lot of recovery of bad loans compared to in the past.
Rwitwika, I want you to pick up on why younger people and women as well voted for Modi. Dr. Swamy's touched on a couple of these points, but the majority would not be there without the young and the female vote, correct?
Absolutely. And I don't think that the answer is very complex, to be honest. I think a lot of what the Prime Minister said resonated with young people and with women. I think a lot of the government programs, whether it was educating the girl child, whether it was the gas program, it really did resonate. And there was a very strong targeted focus towards women, particularly in kind of making them feel as voters that they were relevant to the economy at large. And I think that certainly appealed to the women voters. When it comes to young voters, we look at unemployment, and that certainly is a big issue in India, but it's not an issue which has emerged now. Unemployment has always been there, and especially amongst young people. I think what did resonate with young people was the last 5 years were optimistic. There was a lot of pride with this particular Prime Minister in being Indian, in being able to grow the nation together. And I think that positive messaging, not just for the last year, but the 4 years before that, just really resonated with young people. And I think that's why so many young people and women went out and voted.
Dr. Swamy, I want to move to foreign policy because there was, just before this election, a big standoff, as you know, between India and Pakistan over Kashmir. There have been tensions with China. There has been the US pushing for India to join the quadrilateral and what the US now labeled the free and open Indo-Pacific, which is generally seen as code for ganging up on China. What is going to be the foreign policy of the second Modi administration?
Well, the fundamental is that we want multidimensional Indo-US relations, but we know that China is our neighbor, and we want to be friends with them. and we want to remove misunderstandings. But where we have taken a firm stand, China has also been understanding. We have not agreed to join the what is called as BRI, Border Roads something initiative or whatever. It's been earlier called OBOR, yeah. On Bhutan, there was a problem, but we came to an understanding. And Modi flew to Wuhan and had a one-to-one discussion, and the matter's over. I think we would like a triangular relationship between the United States, China, and ourselves. So but we have commonality with Americans because we got a huge NRI, the non-resident Indian population there. There's a democracy, it's communications much easier. But at the same time, as I say, we have what I would call as a cultural sync with China, and we would like our relations with China to be almost as good, if not somewhat less good.
So it sounds like a bit of balancing going on from New Delhi for the next administration.
Yeah, it is balancing. It is balancing. Yeah, we are not going to choose between the United States and China very much.
Washington might have
there are things that the United States can give us which China can't.
Yeah, Washington might have something to say about that. Shareen, you're sitting here in Washington. Mm-hmm. Obviously, the India-Pakistan relationship critical for stability in the region. Mm-hmm. Where do you see it developing, considering the standoff that we saw over Kashmir and, you know, real risk of war?
Yeah, I mean, that standoff was critical to this election. I think the BJP concedes that in its own messaging right now. If you look at the contrast between 2014 and 2019, you know, in 2014, the message was all development, jobs, policies, anti-corruption. This time, it was nationalism, it was Pakistan, it was strong leaders who can stand up to those security challenges, if you will.
I mean, Modi wouldn't have been the first person running for re-election to sort of rattle the sabers when it comes to foreign relations. But do you see the relationship smoothing over time, or given the Hindu nationalism behind the BJP, perhaps a little bit of escalation here or more tension?
I think, again, it's that ambiguity that is core to the BJP, right? That kind of one face, external looking, which is India strong, India growing, you know, a modern reformist place. And the second one is Hindu nationalism. I think India's foreign policy is going to be determined depending on how they weight these two. I think that the big question right now is, you know, this large mandate is really an opportunity to change India's history, right? This is a very large mandate. Does it go down, does the BJP go, does Modi go down the road of kind of electoral authoritarianism where I won, I get to do what I believe in?
Which is the trend globally right now.
Which is the trend globally, in which case we would see more of a hardline foreign policy towards Pakistan, especially given what we just saw in the election. Yeah. Or do we see a much more a pause, deliberate, build economic strength at home before you try, solidify, you know, India before you try to do that, because we have very real issues in the military, in the, you know, in
reform.
In reform. Economically, there are big headwinds that are not entirely in India's control right now. You know, rising oil prices, a strong dollar. There's a lot that we have to reckon with.
Many large economies thinking exactly the same way at the moment. Srinivas, in terms of the economic policy of India and the world, Dr. Swamy mentioned not being part of the Belt and Road Initiative with China. Where does its economic destiny lie globally? It's not the most free trading power, as we know. There are a lot of entrenched interests. Where does it go in terms of reforming and fit into this sort of debate over globalism and nationalism when it comes to economics?
Yeah, I mean, there is one of the misconceptions about India is that it is a closed economy. Actually, if you look at India's trade openness as defined by exports plus imports, it's actually one of the most open economies in the world. And India actually runs a pretty large deficit with China. And if you go to any Indian store, you will find tons of products made in China. So India is actually a fairly open economy in that regard. So that's not the issue. The issue is one of India trying to, if India tries to grow very rapidly, its imports also trying to grow rapidly. And in a global economy where which is very weak, If our exports are not growing, the trade deficit tends to widen. That's the real problem. How to balance strong domestic economic growth, living in a world where growth is really weak. You see globalization peaking and probably even reversing. And that is the real challenge for India, that the global economy is not cooperative. The global economy is in bad shape.
Rwitwika, I'm going to give you the last word, and perhaps this is an unfair question because I'm going to ask you to look into the crystal ball of the next few years. But what will be the benchmarks of success of a Modi administration? Will it be jobs? Will it be cohesive national identity? Will it be standing up to Pakistan? What will it be?
I think it's going to be a little bit of everything. And thank you for that pressure with looking into the crystal ball. But I think it's going to be a little bit of everything, where I think it's going to be about development. It's definitely going to be not just about India standing up to Pakistan, but if you look at science and technology, India is actually trying to establish itself as a superpower, essentially establish itself on the global stage with what they're doing with the space program. So I think that 5 years from now, the benchmark will be a bit of development. Certainly, I think in terms of on ground a lot more. I think it's going to be a bit of like a strong economy, and then internationally, it's not just about India and Pakistan, but where India lies in the global stage as being taken on as a very serious player on multiple fronts.
And just one follow-up, I mean, you're a woman, you're young. How do the aspirations of Indian women and the youth fit into a new Modi administration? Because it's a very different India from when I visited back in the 1980s and 90s.
I think it's a very promising time to be a young woman in India, and to be young and to be a woman separately as well. It's hard to speak because, as you know, we're not a monolith either. So it's hard to speak for everyone. But I think, whether it's the economy or whether it's how we're growing and the direction in which we're going, I think there's a lot of opportunity, and it's very reinforcing to have a prime minister who says, we need to educate the girl child, or we need to go ahead, and even a lot of the programs on employment or on micro loans or on kind of creating a whole generation of entrepreneurship, a lot of that comes very strongly from the government, and then a lot of it also comes from the civil society and the private sector. So from a government perspective and the prime minister's perspective, it's very reassuring to be a young woman in India right now.
That's a really interesting perspective. I really appreciate you ending our show here from New Delhi, New York, and all points in between. That is it for this edition of The Heat. Before we go this week, remember, we launched our own podcast, and you can listen it through Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. And we'll be covering this topic, similar stories from around the world, and we do it right here on the program as well, but we go a bit more personal and candid with guests and correspondents. I did one on China trade recently, which was a lot of fun. So if you're on the go, give us a listen, and make sure to subscribe. Search online for CGTN and The Heat podcast. I'm Nathan King in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching. See you soon.